Greetings. My name is John Bell, and this is the first of a series of, we're doing them in the afternoon, Summer 2020 Online Puppet Forums. This is number 1, Object Performance in African American Theater History. I wanted to just explain a little bit what we're going to do, and our friend and colleague Paulette Richards is here. I'm going to, okay, I had to make a little technical adjustment. We're really happy that you're all watching. The Ballard Institute, after the COVID-19 pandemic started, moved all of our programming online, and we're currently doing twice weekly puppet workshops Wednesday and Friday afternoons. Now they're being done by Elise Vanasse, really super awesome. Check that out. And our graduate assistant, Felicia Cooper, is going to start helping with those soon. So we thought we'd take advantage of this particular moment to think about puppet history and puppet, I think something I'm calling Puppetry Studies. And that's something that a lot of us puppeteers think about and nerd out about. So in a way, this is a little bit super nerdy, but maybe that's okay, about puppetry studies. The series is going to include a lot of different performers, and starting with Paulette, and then next Thursday, June 11th at 4 p.m., Theodora Skipetaris. And then Scott Shershaw, I'm not going to go into the details, the author of Puppets and Popular Culture, Peter Schumann, director of Bread and Puppet Theater, Claudia Orenstein from CUNY Graduate Center, Jennifer Goodlander, Penny Francis from London, Terry Silvio, who's in Taiwan, Steve Tillis, who's the author of Towards an Aesthetics of the Puppet, Frank Proshin, who is an anthropologist and folklorist who really invented the idea of performing objects back in the 80s. Matthew Cohen, a colleague of mine here at the University of Connecticut. Raphael Fleury from France, and then Dacia Posner, who's currently at Northwestern University. So we're going to put out more information about each of those events. We hope you'll be interested to take part in them. And I think in my mind, as someone who started being interested in puppetry and puppetry history and puppet studies a long time ago, it's kind of trying to figure out, okay, well, what is this? If we wanted to think about puppetry studies, what would that be? And what kind of information would that include at this particular exciting moment? We're really happy that Dr. Paulette Richards is with us. She is an independent researcher and teaching artist who uses animatronic puppetry to introduce K-12 students to basic robotics concepts. She's taught animatronic puppetry workshops at Decatur Makers, Dekalb County Public Library, Center for Puppetry Arts, all in Georgia, of course, and the Puppeteers of America National Festival in 2017. She was the co-curator with me for the Living Objects African American Puppetry Exhibition and Festival and Symposium at the Ballard Institute in 2019, and was recently elected to the UNIMA-USA board. I do want to mention in relation to Living Objects that we have a website of the work connected to that exhibition and related events. And I think my colleague Emily Wicks, who is working backstage here, as it were, will throw up that information on the screen. We are in the process of finally trying to get online the various essays that were created as part of the Living Objects events, including a number of essays by Paulette, which are really fascinating. And eventually we hope to get the videos up there. So that's happening in terms of this ongoing Living Objects project, excuse me. This is very exciting. to think about the situation of object performance in African American theater history. I mean, as we speak, the memorial service for George Floyd is happening right now. It's you know, online, and the past weeks and months have just been full of this. Tragic isn't the right word. The long-standing history of racism and violence against African Americans that goes back, of course, many centuries. And in that respect, I'm really glad that that Paulette is here to talk about object performance in African American theater history. Paulette's presentation, excuse me for talking so much, Paulette. Paulette's presentation is going to be in about 3 different parts. We want to make it possible or include your comments and questions. So I think, you know, after the first part, we'll have a short feedback discussion and deal with your questions. And after the second part, that will do the same. And the third part, which will include a selection of images that Paulette has put together, will also have feedback. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat column of the Facebook feed here. So Paulette, long introduction. We're really happy that you're here. You're whatever, live streaming from your workshop in Atlanta, or I think it's Atlanta, yes, Georgia. Welcome. Thank you. Greetings.
Oh, well, thank you, John. It's wonderful to be here. The topic of object performance in African American theater history I've been studying for most of the past year as a continuation of the research that we started for the Living Objects exhibit. In the beginning, we were wondering if there is a distinct strand of African American puppetry, and if so, does it have a direct link to African object performance traditions? So we did some digging and we came up blank, because in the United States, at least, the creation of figurative objects that represented an African worldview was prohibited under slavery. So the material culture did not survive. What did survive, we found, was a whole performance context that we call the storytelling performance context. And so that's what we focused on the Living Objects exhibit. But after the exhibit, I got curious about traces of object performance in African American theater history. So the first thing to note is that in traditional African societies, there wasn't theater the way that we see it in the West. There's no stage separating the performers from the audience. Instead, drama was part of community building and or spiritual rituals. And it could include music, dance, spoken word performance, and performing objects, particularly masks. So in my reading on the history of African American theater history, one thing that I noticed was that, particularly in the 20th century, there was an ongoing push to reclaim those elements of this whole African performance context, particularly the community building and the spiritual practice. So John started out by talking about this series as a way of sort of interrogating and defining what is puppetry studies. And I'm muddying the water right from the beginning, because my argument is going to be that I'm asking, why is puppetry studies separate from theater history? So because this is a really big question, I am limiting the scope of my investigation today to what we would call serious theater. And so that is, it takes place on a stage and it attempts to communicate some idea to the audience as well as to engage and entertain them. So I'm not going to talk about the vaudeville tradition. I'm not going to say much about musical theater, and I'm not going to say anything about performance art. So that would be people like Nick Cave and Pope L. But my thesis is that African American theater has been moving towards a reintegration of all the figures of African drama. And so it's logical to examine African American object performance in the context of theater history. So I'm going to start with W.E.B. Du Bois's 1913 pageant, The Star of Ethiopia. Du Bois believed that the theater could be a really powerful tool for educating people about African American history and for uplifting the socio-political economic status of African Americans by raising awareness of their plight throughout the society. So the Star of Ethiopia was a pageant. The first performance in New York City in 1913 was part of a 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation celebration, and it included 350 performers. So that right away illustrates or returns to one of the elements of African drama, was that it's a community building activity, because getting 350 people together to do their part at their specific time in a theatrical presentation requires tremendous community building and networking skills. Du Bois presented this pageant several more times in other cities, and the cast in some places was as large as 1,000 people. So that's quite an achievement. The other interesting thing about this show is that it makes reference to the African spirit Shango, who is the Yoruba spirit of lightning. And Shango is the father of the character Ethiopia, who is the protagonist of the show. So right there from the beginning then, we have, as I said, community building and the spiritual element. But the political side came to the fore in 1916 when the NAACP mounted a production of a play by Angelou Weld Grimke called Rachel. This was an anti-lynching play. The NAACP was in the midst of a initiative to get the federal government to pass anti-lynching legislation. It's very sad that it took until the 1990s for us to have federal legislation about hate crimes. And the memorial service for, sorry, I'm triggered here. But anyway, the memorial service that is taking place today as a result of police violence is part of this ongoing struggle. So this play, Rachel, by Angelou Weld Grimke, was first produced in 1916. And that brings us into the theoretical portion of the presentation. So I'm going to stop and see if we have questions or comments that John wants to add.
Thank you very much, Paulette. I I was interested in the way you approached the center of your thinking here, and so if people have questions, please let us know. The way you're looking specifically at theater history,
Mhm.
which is so problematical for us puppeteers because sometimes we feel like we're excluded from that, the way that theater history is normally taught. And the way you mentioned the situation of theater history in relation to popular theater, and you've written a lot and talked a lot about minstrel traditions and the sort of vaudeville minstrel
Mhm.
lower culture aspects of performance that involve puppetry and African American puppetry. And then you also mentioned performance art and in various aspects that also is a place where puppetry thrives. So we're looking at a quite specific moment in American theater history, which is interesting to me because, like, I think of the little theater movement, uh,
Mhm.
that some of the early 20th century things you're thinking about are connected to, and the desires of the folks in the little theater movement, um, I'm thinking including the Provincetown Playhouse's production of Emperor Jones, which was the first integrated cast in New York. The little theater movement's desire to get at some of the things you're talking about as essential to African performance, which is community
Mhm.
and to a certain extent, a certain spirituality.
Mhm.
Um, okay, so uh, some of the questions, Colette Searles says, is Rachel a play we can access?
Oh yes.
And who wrote it?
Angelina Weld Grimke. Um, her father was, I think, on the board of the NAACP, and so it was a moment much like this present moment where atrocities were happening, and um, the NAACP received a $10,000 grant to launch this anti-lynching initiative, and they thought that mounting a play would be a good idea. The approach that Grimke took was to make the protagonist a young woman who discovers from her mother that her father and older brother had been lynched, and the mother never had talked about it. And meanwhile, the young woman is on the brink of getting engaged. But when she receives this news, she's so distraught, and she's feeling, how can I bring children into this world when I can't protect them? And so she ultimately breaks off the engagement with her suitor. But Grimke's approach was to get the audience to identify with the plight of Black mothers who lose their children to this kind of racial violence.
I appreciate your starting, well, with Du Bois, but
Mm-hmm.
before then talking about uh, the roots of abject performance in African society, and then you mentioned carnival masquerades and processions in Caribbean societies.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's
Um,
the paper you have that nobody else has seen that.
I'm looking at your notes, but it's interesting to me with puppetry in the United States is so unusual because, like, with European traditions, which are very often taught as theater history, there are all sorts of strong European puppet traditions that came over with the European immigrant populations, like Punch from England and Kasperl from Germany and Guignol from France and Petrushka from Russia. And those had various interesting histories. But, you know, Native American performance, which also depends on community and ritual and objects and powerful objects, is basically suppressed as, you know, savage or primitive or savage culture. And then, as you've pointed out, I know from hearing your talks in the past, with African culture, African object culture, it's this, what was the word you used? But like a, you know, a cutting off, you know,
there was I call it a psychic amputation.
a psychic amputation.
Yeah, and
That,
so,
sorry, and that's something that, you know, white European immigrant culture did not have to, you know, have to deal with at all. So it seems to me, thinking of what you're talking about, that there's this, the effort to regain
mhm,
a connection, or if I'm not saying that in the wrong way, the effort to make African American object performance reemerge is huge and unique in American or United States history.
mhm. Yeah, so the thesis I'm developing is that, at least in the case of African American object performance, we need to look at the theater history, because this effort to reconnect with, reintegrate the African drama tradition is such an integral part of African American theater history. And that if you do that, then ultimately you run up to the objects, because the objects were part of the African drama context.
Right, right. And then to a certain extent, the degree to which I think of it as straight actors drama, the way that becomes mainstream American theater, it's sort of not, generally speaking, not so interested in non-realistic puppets and masks. So to sort of get those in there is itself a big challenge. And I don't know if we're in a particular moment where we are seeing more of that on American stages now, but there's this, the nature of this challenge, which you're talking about, is fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm.
The next section that you wanted to look at, of course, is a more theoretical framework.
Yes.
And so now we're going to get real geeky,
Yeah.
as it were, and talk about theory and and African American cultural theory, and including work by Fred Moten, who's well, you're going to talk about Fred Moten. So now we're going, excuse me, into this part 2. And people, please, as this goes on, please feel free to continue to share your comments and questions.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up with the psychic amputation that John referenced a moment ago, because what happened when the enslaved Africans arrived in the United States, or what became the United States, is a phenomenon that a theorist named Orlando Patterson describes as social death. So the enslaved were completely disconnected from their original social networks. And in this time of social distancing, I think we've all experienced, to a very small degree, the dislocation that happens when you cannot remain in contact with the people that you know and love. So you can imagine a little bit what it was like for people who had been taken from one side of the Atlantic and brought to the other side, and dropped down in this completely strange context with a strange language, and then compelled to work under very violent and appalling conditions. And they have not even the opportunity or even permission to do some of the things that are psychologically healing that they would have done in their own society, such as make a representation of oneself, and animate that representation in the context of a community that can validate your identity and your experience. So that's the psychic amputation that I'm talking about. So this Fred Moten, now where did I put, John, do you have the title of his essay? Because I did not write that in my note card notes.
Well, the essay's Resistance of the Object, Aunt Hester's Scream.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Moten, he's looking in particular, responding to a section in Marx's Das Kapital, in which Marx discusses the fetishization of commodity objects. And we're not going to dig into that because that's just too geeky. But just to be aware that he's in dialogue with this other theorist. And he points out that in the course of this essay, Marx does a dual ventriloquization, which is first he imagines the commodity object speaking in the voice of the classical economists, and then he attributes the voice of what he thinks the commodity object would say about its situation. So Moten gets into this thought exercise, and his interjection is that at the time Marx was writing Das Kapital and asserting that the commodity object does not speak, in fact, there were commodity objects that spoke, enslaved Africans in the Americas. And so Moten says the convergence of Blackness and the irreducible sound of necessarily visual performance at the scene of objection. So we're looking at the Black body as an object, a commodity object, which in social terms is constrained and unable to speak, or at least unable to be heard, but which nevertheless does resist and vocalize. So he looks at Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative and the famous section in which Douglass learns what it is to be a slave by witnessing the beating of his Aunt Hester. And Douglass describes how she cried out in pain. And so here's where Moten talks about the object, the commodified, objectified Black body, vocalizing, but in a space that is beyond language. So it's only her moans and cries that are heard rather than an articulate speech. And yet where Moten takes this is that there's kind of a break, because Douglass is there witnessing this, so he can see the visual of the Black body. And then the body is unable to speak in an articulate manner, but there is still this sound, the moans, the screams. And so Moten talks about this break and the moaning and the screaming as a point where the sort of the visual aspect of Blackness gets translated into an oral as in ears, not oral as in oral experience. So I'm going to stop for a minute and ask John if I'm making sense.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's very complicated. I think of a couple of things. One is that the way that Fred Moten engages with Marx here is connecting to this European philosophical tradition of thinking about objects and also things, right? Which is an important part of German philosophy, thing theory. But then the African American experience, as you point out, as Fred Moten points out, is this and which I think you're suggesting Marx didn't quite think about or realize, is that this idea of the commodity object that speaks, because of course African Americans were considered to be commodity objects. So, like for me, I'm in a way it's a question I have, but you were eternally presented with this history of the fact that African Americans under slavery, chattel slavery, as you point out, were considered objects. And so does that mean anytime we're thinking about African American object performance or puppet performance, we are drawn back to that
Yes.
shattering idea of humans and objects?
Yes, yes. But it's more hopeful than you think. So where I'm taking this, there was a point when we were working on the living object exhibit where I went off on a wild tangent because of this idea of oral culture. And I thought that since the capacity to create figurative objects had been destroyed, there was a kind of perhaps transubstantiation in which the figurative representation of Black experience moved into the oral realm, into our music. And I started looking at, can we consider instruments as performing objects? At the beginning of the Living Objects exhibit, when we first met with the advisory committee, we had a discussion to define, well, what do we mean by puppets and performing objects? And we came up with the idea that they are, the object has to be a character in a narrative that has some kind of agency that can impact the outcome of the narrative. And I played a little bit with the idea that some musical instruments like B.B. King's guitar are characters that are agents in the narrative arc of the song story or the song testimony, since we're in the blues tradition, and that we do hear them speak, as it were. But that was a little too out there for the exhibit. Now that I'm doing this research, and now that I have access to Moten's work, I think that I wasn't just off in La La Land, and that there was something to this idea of what I call, so Moten had identified this break between the visual and the oral. And so I'm taking that and saying that the break between the material culture of object performance in Africa and its transubstantiation into an oral mode of figurative representation in the Americas, it starts to get healed when African Americans regain the capacity to animate objects in performance by throwing voice. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and see if John has more to add.
Jeff Bragg notes that B.B. King's guitar had or one of his guitars had a name, Lucille.
Yes.
And so it backing up what you were saying earlier, that it does become, Lucille was is a character, a performing object. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would. It's a lot to think about, and this shift from the possibility of three physical objects to the oral object, as it were. I think that's super interesting, and a sign of this struggle or the repression of object performance in, I'm thinking in African American communities. I also wanted to mention that sometimes there's a question of maybe this is tangentially related to what you're talking about, but sometimes when people think of puppets, they think of European style marionettes and hand puppets. And so when puppets are in the United States in the 19th century, the 18th century, well, it's hand puppets or marionettes. But African puppetry, generally speaking, is not using, didn't use those European forms, but it's more, as you pointed out, other types of objects, or the way you described making a figure of yourself or someone. Rod puppets sometimes, sculptures that moved, masks. So we're not going to see a European style African American hand puppet or marionette performance that automatically emerges in the 19th century. And I think I'm digressing from what you're saying, but maybe that's a footnote about the situation of African puppetry. It's more interesting what you're saying than what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that our audience is still with us, I hope. And so the next layer of this theory stuff that I need to build is, I said that by throwing voice, African American object performers in the 20th century have been healing this rupture between the visual figure and the oral figure by animating an object in performance. So instead of being the object, you get to animate the object. And then I started looking at that animation as a space for mediating double consciousness. So we should all be familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, where on the one hand, you are in yourself, in your own sense of identity. So you have an idea of who you are in the castle of your skin. In the Castle of My Skin is the title of a book by a Caribbean writer named George Lamming. But once again, the social death means that when you go out into society, the response to your physical being, your physical presence, is one that annihilates your sense of self. So this double consciousness is a very powerful theme in all kinds of African American cultural theory. So where I'm going with it in terms of object performance is rejoining the work of Steve Tillis, who I'm very glad to hear will be presenting in this forum later in the summer. And his notion in towards the aesthetics of the puppet is that when we view a puppet performance, there's a kind of double vision going on. So we can choose to view the puppet as an object that's animated, or we can choose to accept that the puppet has some kind of life of its own. So that's the doubleness of the puppet vision. And I'm saying that inhabiting a Black body, the double consciousness that you have, and as you move through the larger society, you live that experience of being a puppet. And so what happens then when you pick up a puppet and start animating it? And so from Tillis then, I move to John Bell, who says that in object performance, performer and spectator are both focused on the object, not on each other. So then the object is in a community that affirms its agency, at least for the space of the performance. And so let's break this down again. I said that inhabiting a Black body in US society is an experience of double consciousness of being a puppet, being perceived as a puppet. But if you're animating a puppet, then you're looking at the puppet and the audience is looking at the puppet. And if the performance is succeeding, then all parties involved are accepting the puppet as having some kind of life and agency. And so what does that mean? Giving that life and agency to an object when you yourself exist as a kind of object in the larger society. So I'm going to stop there again and see if John or any of the people listening have questions or comments.
Yeah, so thank you. We welcome your comments and questions. I find that super interesting, the way you're linking Du Bois's sense of the not double vision, but double consciousness, excuse me, Du Bois's sense of double consciousness with Steve Tillis's sense of double vision, and seeing that, and in that way, it seems to me, talking about puppetry and object performance as this fascinating, with it, the potential of that to connect the nature of puppetry with this very particular African-American sense of being that Du Bois talks about, double consciousness, which I think, like a lot of us, like a lot of white folks don't study Du Bois, and for important reasons, but I think a lot of people, not people of color, people of non-color, but might not be familiar with Du Bois's sense of double consciousness. But as you point out, it's a central part of African-American cultural thinking, and I just think it's brilliant the way you're connecting to the possibilities of puppetry in a very essential way. Hannah Leah comments, converting pain into liberation. Wow, do you think, is that what you're talking about in a way?
So once again, I'm coming back to the metaphor that you signaled about the psychic amputation. When I regain the power to represent myself, to figure my own existence, and animate that in front of an audience that affirms the agency of that entity, whatever it is, then that's a really healing thing. And it then reconnects once again with some of the functions of African drama and object performance within it, because healing was a big part of those communal rituals.
My University of Connecticut colleague Adrian Mackey, who focuses on Harlem Renaissance theater, writes, there it is, Harlem's theaters, yay. She writes, I'm really interested in how we name this dynamic double vision and of Du Bois's double consciousness. It's not quite polyvocality. What do we call it? Does that question make sense?
Okay, so I don't have a word for it yet, because in my reading, when I first read Tillis and I saw double vision, it immediately evoked for me double consciousness. Right. And that was another moment where I start riffing and talking to John and feeling like I'm off the deep end again. I'm not making sense here. But now that I'm reeling it back in, it does make some kind of sense.
There's some interesting questions coming in, but for myself, does Du Bois, and again, my ignorance, when Du Bois talks about double consciousness, does he see that as a permanent state? Does he see that as something that could be surmounted in some fashion? Because it sounds like you're saying that puppetry is a way to get at this sense of double consciousness and in a positive healing way, as you said.
Okay, so Du Bois in 1903 said, the problem of the 20th century is the color line. And despite the civil rights movement and the advances that we experienced throughout the 20th century, we come to this moment in the 21st century where we are mourning the victims of state violence. And it looks like this is still a problem of the 21st century. So I think that the double consciousness is permanent as long as the social conditions that create it persist. I hope that's an answer. Wow.
Yeah, there's some interesting comments and questions. Like Frank Proshin, who's I mentioned earlier, is going to be a guest later on in this series, writes, would you connect objectification to infantilization and trivialization? Black bodies cease to be commodity objects with emancipation, but are still considered childlike, which is amplified by the childishness of puppets or dolls.
Okay, so I love this question because I love dolls. This is all my doll stuff. But in our initial planning for the Living Objects exhibit, another discussion that we had was, what's the difference between a puppet and a doll? That was a pretty heated debate. And we finally came to the conclusion that dolls are for individual play and private display, and puppets are for performance before an audience. And so I acquiesced to the board on that one, but I had a different feeling about it. I'm currently working on an essay about dolls. And I don't want to say infantilization, because actually what happened is that the idea of African Americans as docile, childlike, and somehow joyful within the situation of enslavement prevailed during the period of enslavement. And then after emancipation and after the brief political gains of the Reconstruction period, this myth of the violent Black beast took over to justify the violent repression of African Americans. So we lost that idea of childlike. But what I wanted to say about dolls is that, once again, in the whole African drama complex, this line between doll and puppet is not neat like it is here, and that the article I'm currently working on is about African American doll collectors who formed a community, a loose community of bloggers between like 2010, 2015, and who used the new social media to perform with their dolls. There were a series of videos that they made, and that is object performance, even if it's not puppets.
Right.
So I want to go ahead.
No, I was thinking of, was it Black Moses Barbie? Was that Pierre Benoit? Yeah. And also, like, shout out to Mark Ruffin from Black Dolls Matter, which is, Colette Searles, if I may, says, now the comments are commenting on the comments. Frank makes a very interesting point. Paulette, you are also in many ways expanding the metaphor of the puppet away from the marionette as something controlled by others, as in a political puppet. You're the puppet, I'm not the puppet, you're the puppet, as our president once said, and towards the performing object, which we are defining as something with agency and spirit separated from the human, but affirmed.
Okay, good. Thank you, Colette, for that, because I had just two more little points on the theoretical part of the presentation, and you opened the door for me to make them. And that is that there is a body of work by theorists who look at lynching as a ritualized spectacle, as a performance. And when we think about the video, and those officers knew that they were being videotaped, and they continued with this performance. And the word marionette there, there's a writer named Wendy Harding who looked at some of the photographs of lynchings, because lynchings were like public festivals. They often took place in the town square. People would come and bring a picnic and their children, and they would take photographs and make postcards of them, souvenirs of these events. So Wendy Harding looks at one of these photographs where the lynch rope has broken the victim's neck, but the photographer has placed a hat on its head. And she describes the lynched body as looking like a marionette. And so that this lynching performance, it dangles the Black body from a string like a marionette in order to enact this ritual of white supremacy. So that was, so that is the ultimate objectification of the Black body. And yes, I am looking at object performance when African Americans are empowered to animate their own figures as a liberating, humanizing response.
I know we wanted to get to the next part with the images, and Barbara Ann Tier. But Edna Bland, so maybe, I don't know if we can answer these all, but Edna Bland asks, well, first of all, Bruce Cannon from Swedish Cottage Marionette Theater says, as a performer performing marionettes in full view of the audience, I experience what you are saying firsthand. Edna Bland asks, how important is it for African Americans to use ethnic puppets in performance, even when narrative isn't focused on a historical character?
So another one of my theories about what is distinct about African American puppetry is that inevitably African American object performers are countering, they are healing the image of blackface minstrelsy. And I don't think it matters whether you're using a figure that represents a human of whatever race, or whether you are animating an animal or, you know, your pen. But I think that because, you know, one of the insights that I had while I was working on a different essay earlier in the spring is that thanks to Colette Serrels, who gave a presentation on material characters last summer at P of A, is that the minstrel characters like Aunt Jemima, or the jolly N-word who eats a coin, he's a bank, those material characters were so widespread, not just throughout the United States, but all over the world, that many people who never saw a minstrel show encountered those images of African Americans. And so anytime that we are creating figures and animating them, we are healing all of that stuff. These are our material characters rather than the ones that were imposed on us. I hope that answers Edna's question.
Maybe one more it's more of a comment before we move on. Stefano Brancato, who's a UConn Puppet Arts graduate, who's in New York, says, the theory of double consciousness as it pertains to the human African-American experience appears to have deep roots in American racism. The idea of a slave as an object that one has power over, much like the relationship between a puppet and puppeteer, would suggest that the racist may experience a loss of power or ownership over the objects they once controlled. A naughty thought here. I don't know if you have a response to that.
I think, yeah, we'd have to get really metaphysical there and start to interrogate how Western culture looks at objects versus other cultures. And I know, because I've been working on a piece about performing objects in Japanese society, that the Japanese have always seen objects as having a kami, a spirit. And so the idea that you would have this godlike power over an object and that it is devoid of spirit would be alien in that context.
There's a few more comments, but I'm feeling like maybe we could hold off on like Patrick Crawford's question until the end, and maybe move into the exciting visual portion of your presentation.
Okay. Okay.
And hold on to Patrick Crawford's question.
Okay. All right. So we'll go to the slideshow. So we did some historical context, and then we did some really heavy theoretical lifting, and that was to prepare for this lineage of object performance that I have found in African-American theatrical productions. I've started here with the image of the Gelede body mask. The Gelede ritual in the Yoruba society is a festival that incorporates all these elements of drama that I spoke about before: dance and music and spoken word art, and also object performance. So I'll move on to could I have the next slide, please, Emily? Yeah, so one of the first examples I found, the puppets were not actually present when Marita Bonner published The Purple Flower in 1927. She published it in Crisis magazine, which was the organ of the NAACP, and it won one of the NAAC's prizes that year, and it received all kinds of critical accolades, but it was never staged until 2011, when Kelly Garrett did an adaptation with puppets. I think one of the reasons it was never staged is because it's a surrealist world in which there are the us's and the white devils. And so the description of the white devils, when I read it, I immediately thought, oh, this would work really great as puppets. But John also mentioned earlier that in the realm of quote unquote serious theater, the move away from mimetic realism into these kind of abstract and surreal forms or realms in which puppets function very well is often troubling. So I'll just read a little bit of her description of the white devils. They're artful little things with soft, wide eyes, such as you would expect to find in an angel. Soft hair that flops around their horns. Their horns glow red all the time, now with blood, now with eternal fire, now with deceit, now with unholy desire. They have bones tied carefully across their tails to make them seem less like tails and more like decorations. So the difficulty of staging that, of imagining how to stage that, may in part explain why the show was never produced in Marita Bonner's lifetime. Next slide, please. Okay, thanks to Adrian Mackie Branconi's book, I identified this production of Andrew Cleese and the Lion by the Harlem Negro unit of the Federal Theater Project as another example of object performance in African American theater. Did I want to say something else about that? Oh yeah, the Lion is what we would call a body puppet. Ad Bates was a dancer, and so it sort of anticipates the staging of the Lion King later on. Next slide, please. In 1961, Jean Genet's The Blacks premiered at St. Mark's Playhouse. This show was not written, produced, or directed by anyone of African American descent, but it was about the colonial situation in Africa, and it featured these masks created by Patricia Zoprot. It's also an extremely important production in African American theater history because of the actors who were in the cast and their influence on that whole era of African American theater. So James Earl Jones, Roscoe Lee Brown, Louis Gossett Jr., Godfrey Cambridge, Cicely Tyson, and later Maya Angelou were all in this cast. Next slide, please. So in the late 60s and early 70s, we have the advent of the Black Arts movement, which was the cultural arm of the civil rights movement. And the Negro Ensemble Company produced 2 shows in which I found evidence of the use of masks. One was Derek Walcott's Dream on Monkey Mountain. And here's a stage direction from, let me find it, yeah, that says, man is dressed by the mammies in the mask of the great white father with the long white reach. It is a full body mask constructed to stand on its own. Oh, I'm sorry. This is from George Houston Bass's Black Mask, The Passion of Darky's Bones. So that's the second show that came out in that year. The hands, this is of the great white father with the long white reach, can be detached from the arms to allow long white strips of fabric to unfold and wrap about the figures of people and things that become the possessions of the great white father. The hands keep reaching and claiming until the great white father is trapped by the mass of his earthly possessions of people, places, and things, entangled in the long white strips of fabric. 3 members are masked by the mammies to perform in the dream ballet as the helping hands of fate. Okay, next slide, please. So this is George Houston Bass, who wrote that show and who established the Rights and Reason Theater at Brown University. The image here is the cover of a magazine called Black Masks, the official magazine of the Black Theater Network. And I think it's very significant that they chose to use the title Black Masks. So moving on from there. One of the difficulties that I found in doing this research is that if the show didn't happen in New York, or it wasn't reviewed in a publication that professionals in New York were aware of, then it didn't happen in the historical record. Fortunately, Philip Walker's solo show, Can I Speak for You, Brother, made it into the Dictionary of African American Theater History, which is how I found out about it. And then I tracked him down, and you can see at the bottom, there's a link to a YouTube clip where there's part of the show. This is a solo show about 9 African American leaders. And I think that Walker probably resorted to puppets so that he could put them in dialogue with each other, even though he's a solo performer. Next slide, please. So by the end of the 70s, Ntozake Shange had made a tremendous splash with For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide, When the Rainbow Is Enough, from 1976. She's credited with inventing a form called the choreo poem, but of course the choreo poem rejoins this African drama context in which dance could carry the story as well as the other elements of theatrical presentation. So in 1979, she did a new show called Spell Number 7. And what you can see on the cover of the book is the minstrel masks that the cast wears in the beginning of the show. And at the top of the image, there's a big white grin. You can see that's from a large mask that dominated the set. And then there's a point in the show where the actors remove those masks in a very ritualized way to symbolize they are rejecting and coming out from under the minstrel stereotypes that they have been forced to live with. Next slide, please. In 1981, Pearl Clegg created a show called Puppet Play. And this puppet is preserved in the archives at Emory University because Clegg was based in Atlanta for a large portion of her life. This show had 2 women who played different aspects of a wife character, and then the husband was a puppet. And according to the records I found, our friend Brad Brewer was the puppeteer for the show. Okay, next slide, please. In 1989, George C. Wolfe mounted an adaptation of 3 plays, short stories by Zora Neale Hurston. Hurston actually wrote a play called Spunk, and Wolfe sort of adapted that and added these other 2 stories in order to make a full-length show. And it included puppets. So I'm seeing that the puppets are coming in more and more as we advance through time. Next slide, please. And here I wanted to put in kind of a footnote, which is that Hurston, I was trained in the literature department, and so I knew about Zora Neale Hurston as a novelist, and I knew about her anthropological writings. I didn't know anything about her work in theater and in film, but she very much wanted to succeed as a playwright. And her first, her effort was to get this show, The Great Day, produced. She did manage to open it on Broadway in 1932, but she never found a backer. And so it had the 1 performance, which everyone said was great. And then she did it again in Florida at Rollins University, and then it just went away, faded. But once again, difficulties of research. I've been trying to find images from this show, which was a review that featured African-American folklore that she had collected in her field research. And the end was the West Indian fire dance. The costumes for that dance made a great sensation. The photographs that I found of that dance are kind of blurry, and I can't tell whether anybody's wearing anything that we would call a mask or not. But I'm including this show here because it has all of the other elements of the African dramatic, the African drama context. And it had a deep influence on modern dance choreographers such as Doris Humphrey, who's actually credited as the choreographer for the show, even though Hurston is the one who used film that she had taken in the Bahamas to train the dancers. Next slide, please. And so the lineage that I'm tracing culminates in The Lion King on Broadway, which once again was not written, produced, directed, or designed by people of African American descent, but it features so many Black actors in the cast, and so many of those have gone on to have important careers in theater, that it is inevitably part of African American theater history. It's worth noting how much money the show has earned since 1997, because it incorporates the dance, the music, the object performance, the sense of community, and even a kind of spiritual message. So all of those elements can succeed in a Western style theatrical presentation. We just have not seen an African American created show receive that kind of financial support up to this point. So next slide, please. And then the one after that. There are a lot more sources that I consulted in developing this presentation, but I put the main theoretical ones here so that we could be oriented in terms of where is all of this coming from. And that's the end of what I have prepared to say.
That's wonderful, Paulette, thank you. I wanted to mention, thinking of the sources you just showed us, that this forum right now is going to be online, available online for viewing, the full program on our Facebook page and also on our YouTube channel. Thanks. Thank you very much, Emily Wicks. So people can refer to that and can go back and look at those sources you're looking at after this event particularly is over. I was fascinated by this overview of African American theater, right? As you said earlier at the outset, we're not thinking about puppet theater per se or art, performance art, but the way that masks and puppets seem to present themselves as such useful theatrical forms. And I'm thinking of I remember reading Marita Bonner's play, and I think having the same or a similar thought as yours, thinking like, oh, this would be a really great puppet show, because it wants to deal with race in a sort of non-realistic, symbolic, I think you use the term surrealistic form, and you think, oh, of course, puppets would be good for that. And I also thought of the Genet play, in which the masks, they're white masks being worn and performed by African-American actors. So the masks, and they have a little bit of sort of non-realistic, maybe the designs are influenced by someone's vision of African aesthetics, I don't know. But white masks with Black actors, the masks are themselves presenting racial difference, as opposed to like the masks in The Lion King, which they are presenting racial difference in a way, but or actually they're not. But
yeah.
The way that masks can do this also. You know, it's like the metaphorical idea of masks, just as the puppet, as you mentioned earlier, has a certain metaphorical significance. I wanted to mention, because you didn't, in a text you shared with us earlier, you mentioned Barbara Ann Teer and the Black Arts movement. And she always struck me, I mean, I think for the reasons you mentioned her, because most of the Black Arts movement playwrights were, as it seems to me, writing, you know, plays for actors. And I think Teer was also going in this other direction. You mentioned in the fact that she had seen Gele mask spectacles, an image of which you showed at the beginning. And she seems like she's an African-American artist who's like, okay, let's go there. And she literally goes to Nigeria with her actors to experience African culture, and comes back. I think the National Black Theater in Harlem, in the way that it, as I understand it, was interested in community performance and was heading in that direction that would make use of masks and puppets a kind of obvious technique to use. So yeah, those were some thoughts that I had in response. I don't know about the money. Like the Lion King's doing pretty well on Broadway. I mean, in part, I think it's, you know, Julie Taymor went to Indonesia and experienced a culture where mask and puppet performance were integral to the culture and have very strong spiritual, religious, cultural presence. And then she comes back and says, well, puppets are the obvious thing to do for the Lion King. I in a way that connects to the kind of thing, value of puppets and objects you were talking about in terms of African culture. Those are some thoughts I had. And we were a little bit, we're open-ended here. I don't think we want to spend all day here, but maybe we could, if you don't mind, Paulette, referring back to a question Patrick Crawford wrote, the two double experiences, and going back to this idea of double consciousness and double vision, the two double experiences both seem to converge in part at the agency and power of the puppet object as a unique and symbolically rich bridge between the performer and the audience. Is that an at all accurate impression of one of the many ideas your dialogue is illuminating?
Yes, yes. I think he actually said it better than I did. But now I want to rejoin this to, I guess the theoretical thesis I was developing is that the puppet is an opportunity, a space where African-American performers can humanize themselves as they're animating the puppet, because the audience is looking at the puppet and accepting it as an entity with agency, and therefore it may also accept the performer. And I started developing this idea when I had gone to the University of Central Florida to give a presentation, and I was walking across campus with a puppet. It's a Muppet style puppet of an African-American man. He's bald, he's got a mustache, he's wearing a polo shirt. And every few steps, people were like, oh, that's so cute. Oh, let me see. And I felt like if I were walking with a live African-American man, I'm sure that he would not have gotten the same response. And that made me wonder, just along the lines of the famous doll test, where children's responses to dolls of different colors revealed their internalized racism. I wondered, I'm looking for the psychologists that want to help me test this. What kind of response do puppets bring out of people? And is it easier for people to relate to a puppet that looks different from themselves than it is to relate to a person?
maybe we can look forward to that research happening and you writing about it.
Yeah. Then the other intervention that I had about The Lion King, when the movie came out, it was in the period when Disney was in a mode of sort of deliberate multiculturalism. So they had done The Little Mermaid with Caribbean music. So I always think of her as passant blanc, she's passing for white. And then they had done Beauty and the Beast, and they had done Pocahontas and Aladdin. And so I've been waiting, okay, where's the Black Princess? Where's the Black Princess? And they come out with their African movie and there are no people in it. It's all animals. And I thought that was really telling at the time, even though I enjoyed the movie. Sure. And I think that that is also an issue with this show. Because when they came out with The Lion King, I was like, well, no, they should have done Aida, the opera about the Ethiopian princess. Mm-hmm. And in fact, after they did The Lion King, they had an option on a version of Aida. It was a book, a children's book that Leontine Price produced, and they got her illustrator, and they were going to do it as an animated film, and they lined up Elton John again to do the music, and he did not want to do another animated film, but he was interested in doing a Broadway show. So they did a Broadway show of Aida, but not a princess movie. We didn't get the princess movie until The Princess and the Frog. And the green face paper that will eventually be published as part of the Living Out catalog, the guts of that were my commentary on The Princess and the Frog. And I never published it, so I just repurposed it. Anyway, all of this to say that for all that is good and wonderful about The Lion King on Broadway, at the end of the day, it's still troubling that instead of having the Black body on stage, we have these anthropomorphic masks imposed over top of them.
But is that really would it be a problem if, that's interesting, because we've been talking all along about the positive possibilities of masks and puppets. And here it seems like you're saying this is problematic in The Lion King. Is that because it's Julie Taymor as a white artist, her version of this Disney version of an African kind of story?
I think, well, so now I'm digging myself another hole that I'll have to spend a year researching. I have not seen the whole show. I've seen clips on YouTube. But I think what happens is the same thing that happens in the film, which is this refusal to deal with Black humans.
Right.
And so when the audience goes to that show and they accept the reality of the puppets, some of the puppets are not even animate creatures, they're grass, right? Mm-hmm. So they accept the reality of the puppet, but do they ever get to the humanity of the performer underneath? That's the question that will take me another year to answer.
Okay. I would note a couple of comments. Hannah Leah said, Jackie Elaine Bell is disseminating resources and gathering like minds on the topic of improving Black production opportunities and Black experiences general on Broadway. Mm-hmm. And Adrian Mackey said, thanks for the shout out. And another Federal Theater Project show that might be worth looking into, and which Perry Watkins designed, is a production of Pinocchio. Thank you, Adrian. I do think at this point, maybe we should be thinking, we look forward to our next encounter with Paulette. Hannah Leah says, feels like maybe there's a layer of the bestialization of Black bodies at play here. There's a there's a comment. Okay. I wanted to, I'm looking at another comment by Tia Penfill, which is interesting. I'm thinking, given the time frame here, that maybe we should say we'll move on to the next chapter at some point. And we did want to, let's see, we wanted to ask you, Paulette, what you're planning in the future, because I know you're thinking about some online events that will continue actually this research.
Okay, so just this afternoon we had kind of an urgent moment with Edna Bland. The Puppeteers of America is putting out a statement in solidarity with the protesters, and the Ballard Institute has done so as well. And we want to thank the puppetry community for electing us to the boards of, Edna is on the Puppeteers of America board, and I'm newly elected to the UNIMA-USA board, and for really demonstrating a commitment to inclusiveness. One of the things that we have been talking about doing is kind of a repeat of the Living Objects Festival and Symposium, only a virtual one. So we are in the process of, we're hoping to start planning for that, but we want to alert people that this is an idea that's on the table, and we would like to make that happen.
Great. Is there a date set for that, or you're still working on that?
We're still working on it.
Okay. And you mentioned you have a few articles you're working on that are going to appear as part of your ongoing research.
Yeah, so there's an article that I call Retrieving Living Objects from the City of the Dead, which is based on a presentation I did in the Critical Exchange sessions last summer at P of A. That's sort of a personal healing journey. I will also out myself as having lost playmates as a child. They were disappeared. The videos of police violence are disturbing, but also they force the larger society to confront these things, but they are the tip of the iceberg of violence against Black bodies. African Americans are about 13% of the US population, but according to the FBI, we are 34% of the reported missing persons. And some of my playmates were in that statistic. So I've been triggered all week. Making puppets, doing this research has been a really powerful way of healing for me. So that article should be coming out. I also recently submitted a piece called Figuring Race, which is a review of the performances in the Living Objects Festival. And we will hope that the Southeastern Theater Conference Symposium accepts that one. This is where a lot of the Moten theory came from. Dr. Isabella Brochado, who was a presenter at the Living Objects Symposium, invited me to submit a piece to a Brazilian publication that she is guest editing. And so that's where hopefully my research on the doll community will come out.
Great.
So yeah, I have a lot of irons in the fire.
And they're all very exciting. Lizzie Duquette says, how can we monetarily support Paulette's work? that's interesting. I don't know if that's there's an obvious answer to that. We could post, I don't know if you have an immediate answer to that.
Well, I will give a shout out, a thank you here, because what I've presented here, it actually started because Oliver Rogers, who came to the symposium, asked me to write a critical introduction to her plays. And she had heard about the Living Objects project, but wasn't sure that her work fit into it because she uses dolls as performing objects in plays for theatrical presentation. And that's what got me thinking about object performance in theater. And when I agreed to do that, I received a small grant from Heather Henson. So my work has been supported. And I want to thank Alva and Heather for that.
Stefano Brancato says, can we do a part 2 with Paulette? That's a great idea. I don't know when it can happen. Colette Searles says, so glad you're publishing what you spoke about at the Critical Exchange. How can we learn when, where it will be available? And like some of your essays, as I said at the outset, will be posted online as part of our Living Objects African American Puppetry online catalog. So it's taken us a really long time to get those essays online.
Let's financially support that project first.
Well, thank you. Okay, here's a comment by Patrick Crawford. Drama and comedy, both as the universal symbol of theater, seem to hold the potential to reverse, invert, or flip things positively or negatively. The insight you've opened is how those opportunities multiply in either direction when speaking through objects. Which
wow, so elegant, yes.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to add that the upcoming, since we're drawing to a close, the upcoming workshops on our Facebook page of the Ballard Institute include tomorrow, Friday, Elise Van Ness doing a Make Egg Carton Heads workshop. Next Wednesday, Elise will be doing a jellyfish puppet workshop. And next Friday, Make a Puppet of Your Pet. And again, next Thursday, which is June 11th, our guest will be Theodora Skipetaris, puppeteer based in New York City. So I think a lot of us puppeteers really appreciate your very tidy workshop behind you. It's a goal that many of us have, to have a tidy workspace, and you've achieved it. We thank you, Paulette. We're so lucky at the Ballard Institute to have been able to collaborate you on a number of projects, including this one. Super exciting. It made us, I think, all think a lot. Will advance the cause of puppetry studies. And we thank you very much, Paulette. And thank you, Emily Wicks, behind the scenes, making everything happen. So thank you, Paulette.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, everyone, for watching. We appreciate it.